Zombie Children from Dead Mothers, written by Ren Bryant, read by the author. Part 1, The Clinic. Dr. Julian Rothbard was at ease with the death happening before him, something he had seen many times before while working at the Hurslander private clinic. "She's bleeding out," he said with an undertaker's passion. "Definitely no way to save her." His face was stoic as a dying mother's blood circled the cold metal mortuary table. "And the baby?" Dr. Treppe asked. Unlike Rothbard, Treppe was unsettled. His thin face was pale, and he tapped his foot impatiently, watching an unborn 9-month-old fetus stir inside a pregnant woman moments from the great beyond. This was his first experience with a zombie birth. "Another for the project," Rothbard said. "We wait until the mother dies, then we extract. If the baby tests zombie positive, that brings us to a baker's dozen. It will be the most zombie children we've ever had." Losing patience was nothing new to Dr. Rothbard. In fact, that was the whole point. The mother must die. He had been working deep in the woods of the northeast kingdom of Vermont at the Hurslander Clinic for 4 years now. And while not all the pregnant women who died after arriving at Hurslander's doors produced zombie babies, they've had a great run of luck since Rothbard joined as their chief clinical doctor. The clinic was the brainchild of Dr. Ralph Hurslander from Zurich, Switzerland. After he was kicked out of his native country in 1947 for illegal medical experiments, he immigrated to the United States and opened up the nondescript facility in the most remote location he could find. Dr. Hurslander's experiments focused on children born after their mothers had died during pregnancy. It was during World War II, when he was helping across the border in Germany, that he first noticed something strange. There, the good doctor saw pregnant women torn to shreds by Allied bombing raids. While most were killed immediately, and their fetus died with them, some women clung to life. They screamed for help. They pleaded for someone, anyone, to save their baby. But no one did. After they died, Dr. Hurslander noticed that for some of these women, their fetus still moved inside the dead woman's womb. Dr. Hurslander was repulsed. He didn't believe what he saw at first. That his eyes were playing tricks on him, that the horror of war was making him mental. Yet, he couldn't deny what was happening. The fetus survived. Some clawed and gummed through the uterus and belly, popping out like a jack-in-a-box covered in blood and yellowish amniotic fluid. Others clawed and gummed their way out of the dead mother's loose birthing canal. Dr. Hurslander watched as the zombie babies devoured their dead mother's flesh, growling in rabid sickness as they tore off miniature chunks of meat with their sharp gums. Upon seeing such an abomination, Dr. Hurslander did what any self-respecting Christian would do. He shot and killed these hellish creatures. Yet, as repulsed as he was, he couldn't stop his intellectual curiosity. After the war, Dr. Hurslander wanted to see if he could replicate what he saw, and whether there was anything humanity could learn from such a discovery. At the Zurich hospital where he worked, Dr. Hurslander secretly paid emergency room physicians and nurses for pregnant women at death's door, the ones they couldn't save. Hospital management eventually found out about his experiments and he was fired immediately. His license to practice medicine was revoked and his reputation was ruined in the European medical community. With no prospects for work and alienated by friends and society, he left for the U.S. There, he found a remote piece of land in Essex County, Vermont, the perfect place to restart his work. Dr. Hurslander's cover job was serving as the county mortician, performing autopsies and other services when called upon for the police and the court. Given the lack of population in the area, there weren't too many dead bodies for him to examine, so he had ample time for his experiments. Like in Zurich, he worked with ambulance and emergency room doctors to get near-dead pregnant women to the clinic. The first few years were slow. Only 2 women came through the clinic's doors, and both had zombie-negative babies. But shortly thereafter, he got his first zombie-positive baby. He named her Eve. With Eve, he learned how zombie babies rejected breast milk, and how they only grew by eating human flesh. Unfortunately, Dr. Hurslander didn't properly store the dead mother, and Eve survived only 6 months before there was no more food and she died. Over the years, Dr. Hurslander brought in assistants, usually other doctors he met at conferences, ones he could trust to keep quiet. Dr. Hurslander died in '87, but his clinic continued under the supervision of a Dr. Murray Steiner. who left in '02 and turned the reins over to Dr. Rothbard. Rothbard continues in the same role today. Dr. Trappe, on the other hand, had only been at the clinic a few months. Since he joined, his only role had been to feed the caged zombie children frozen chunks of meat. He was troubled by the work at first, but kept telling himself it was necessary for science. The pregnant woman now dying on the mortuary table was his first real patient. It took all his strength not to intervene and try to save the woman and her baby. Watching a person die while doing nothing went against the oath he took as a doctor to protect and save human life. From the table, Dr. Trappe saw the woman's hand twitch. Then he heard a faint gurgle and a wheeze, which made the hair on the back of his neck stand up. I didn't think she was still coherent, Dr. Trappe said. He bent down to get a closer look at the patient. Is there something wrong? Another wheeze and a gurgle of blood, this time spitting out of the woman's mouth. Then a weak whisper, "Save my baby, please." It was Miss Samantha Radish's dying wish. She had shown up at the clinic with 5 stab wounds and a collapsed lung, thanks to a present from her boyfriend. He was a man who liked to use his fists quite often, and on this particular night he pulled out a buck knife after a few too many tall boys. "Shouldn't we somehow intervene?" Dr. Trappe asked. "No, these things happen sometimes," Rothbard responded, continuing to stare at Samantha with indifference. "We don't deviate from the plan. Mother dies, extract the baby. If it's zombie positive, it goes with the rest in the cage downstairs." Usually the women brought to the clinic were so close to death that the baby was extracted within minutes of arrival. Samantha was hanging around longer than expected, putting up a valiant effort. She wanted to live. For 9 months she carried another life in her belly. She did everything right to bring a new human into the world and was only weeks away from her due date. Baby Jake was supposed to be her salvation from domestic violence. Baby Jake would make the punches stop. Unfortunately for Samantha, she was right about that, just in a way she could never have imagined. Dr. Trappe kept his eyeballs focused on the mother, now moments away from death. He watched her breath become slower and slower, then stop. When her body went limp, he checked for a pulse and found none. "Careful, the fetus is moving," Rothbard said. "Zombie positive, no question." Dr. Trappe looked to the belly and saw movement under the mother's skin. A baby's hand stretching the belly, pushing outward, seeking freedom. "Get the cage ready," Rothbard said. "They may be tiny, but they can move fast." Dr. Trappe put on leather gloves and placed a metal cage that was baited with human flesh over Samantha's pregnant belly. 2 baby hands clawed at dead flesh, pushing closer to the surface, stretching, stretching, stretching. The skin was so tight it was almost translucent, and Trappe could make out all 10 baby fingers. He could hear scratching sounds, tiny hands digging and ripping the uterus, trying to get out. And then finally, the skin broke, and a glob of blood and fluid belched onto the mortuary table and floor, getting on the doctor's shoes. A newborn head covered in gore popped out of the hole, causing Trappe to jump back and nearly drop the cage he was holding. Zombie positive, no question, just as Rothbard said it would be. The baby growled as it smelled the meat in the cage, then pushed its way out of the dead mother to get the prize. Trappe quickly closed the cage door, latched the lock, and let out a sigh of relief. It was at this point that Trappe questioned his decision to work at the Hearstlander Clinic. Feeding a group of caged zombie kids frozen meat was one thing, but seeing the horror of a zombie birth was something grotesquely different. Trappe thought he should have stuck with the family business. His father ran a funeral parlor in Quebec, Canada, and the plan was for him to take over. But that wasn't good enough for Kevin Trappe. No, he wanted to do more than prep cadavers. His passion was necrotic forensics and finding new medical uses for dead tissue. He met Dr. Rothbard at a continuing education clinic in the Bahamas, and, well, one thing led to another, and now here he was at the Hearstlander Clinic, nearly losing his lunch as a zombie baby chewed on his dead mother's flesh. With the baby in the cage, Dr. Rothbard went to work with the bone saw, cutting Samantha into easily chewable chunks to feed her son. Dr. Trappe took the cage to the basement, holding it out at arm's length, afraid of the snarling feral beast inside. The basement housed all the zombie children, who ranged from 18 months to 14 years in age. On their 15th birthday, the zombie children got their brains blown out with a captive bolt pistol. At that age, they grew too rapidly and required too much flesh, more than the Hearstlander clinic could keep in stock. "What a fucking horror show you are," Trepay said to his captive basement audience as he put the cage down on the floor. "God help us all." The good doctor grabbed the catch-all animal control pole off the wall and cinched the wire noose around the newborn zombie's neck, carefully extracting it from its cage. As he pushed and pulled the baby, Trepay paused, feeling queasy. He held the pole with one hand and used his free hand to fish for a handkerchief in his pocket to wipe the sweat off his forehead. As he paused, Trepay didn't follow protocol, which called for a 1-foot distance between the doctors and the zombie cage at all times. He kept his eyes focused on the newborn, scared it could somehow break the noose. Behind him stood the other zombies, the ones Trepay wasn't watching, the ones reaching out with their scrawny, half-rotten arms from the gaps in the cage. Trepay felt a tug at the back of his laboratory coat, causing him to nearly hit his head on the ceiling as he screamed and jumped. In his fright, he also dropped the catch-all pole. The newborn zombie crawled towards his feet, drooling, growling, following the smell of fresh meat. Trepay scrambled for the pole, grabbing it and regaining control just before the zombie gnawed at his foot. Using both hands, he picked up the newborn, hanging him by the noose of the catch-all. "You little fucker," Trepay said as he threw the baby in with the other zombies and quickly closed the cage door, before turning and running up the stairs as fast as he could, stumbling as he reached the top step. "All okay?" Rothbard asked. His gloved hands were covered in Samantha's blood. Rothbard turned and looked at Trepay, who was hunched over and catching his breath. "You look like you've seen a ghost. Or maybe a zombie." Rothbard couldn't help but chuckle. "Sorry, zombie humor. Couldn't resist." Trepay shook his head back and forth like his brain had been rattled, but he said, "Yeah, all good." In truth, he was far from good. He almost died down there. Trepay opened his mouth to say something, but then closed it again. Dr. Rothbard didn't need to know about what happened, Trepay thought. No harm, no foul. "I'm going to step outside for a smoke," Trepay said. "You okay in here?" "Yeah, I'm fine," Rothbard said. He was making surgical cuts into Samantha Radish, taking off her limbs but leaving the torso intact. She'd eventually be processed further, into pieces more manageable for a newborn, but that was a job for tomorrow. In the early days of the clinic, Dr. Hearstlander figured out that in their first year of life, zombie children needed about a half pound of meat a day to survive. Some needed more, some needed less, but half a pound was the general rule of thumb the clinic went by. That meant an average weight mother could provide up to 8 months of food for a newborn zombie if rationed properly. As Trepay was about to step outside, Dr. Rothbard added, "I remember when I saw my first birth. It was a doozy. They're never pretty or easy to stomach, but you'll get used to it. Don't worry." Trepay nodded without looking back and exited the clinic for his smoke. As he pulled out his pack of Camel King Size from his lab coat pocket, Trepay noticed his hands were shaking. It wasn't from the cold. He lit up, closed his eyes, and took a few deep drags to try and calm himself. As he worked his way down the cigarette, he wondered how the clinic survived all these years, and whether the work they were doing really helped make the world a better place. When he did his recruitment pitch in the Bahamas, he told Trepay that Hearstlander's study of tissue decomposition helped advance the field of forensics like nothing else. He said they know so much about the way a body decays they even developed and sold an anti-wrinkle cream to the Coty company. These advancements, Rothbard said, were how the clinic was able to pay so well. He also said while the money helped keep people quiet about the clinic's true nature, the people working there were also true believers to the cause. They were hand-picked, so there were never any concern about news leaking. Trepay liked the idea that he was someone special, someone hand-picked to advance science. So he signed up to work at the clinic without even setting foot inside the facility. Trepay pulled one last big drag on his cigarette. "For the cause," he said. He extinguished the cigarette butt under his foot and was about to turn the doorknob and re-enter the clinic when he heard an agonizing scream from inside. Then came the sound of metallic mortician tools crashing onto the tile floor. Trepay froze. This was bad. Part 2. The Cavalry. Dr. Trappe rushed inside the clinic. Rothbard! There, on the floor, was Dr. Rothbard being chewed by 2 zombies. His guts were splayed, just like Samantha's on the mortuary table. Other zombie children were slowly stumbling their way up the basement stairs, moaning, growling, going towards the scent of flesh. Trappe's hands covered his mouth in revulsion. He wanted to save his friend, but knew he was too late. One bite was all it took. As he watched the zombies chew and gnaw fresh meat, Trappe's brain tried to process how this was happening. The zombies were locked in the cage downstairs. The cage. Did I not? He replayed what happened in the basement after the zombie grabbed his lab coat. I threw the newborn in the cage, and then I ran. Oh, dear God, no, Trappe said aloud. I never locked the cage. What have I done? The zombie eating Rothbard's guts looked towards the sound of Trappe's voice and growled. Trappe slowly backed away and exited the clinic, quietly closing the door behind him and leaning against it to prevent the zombies from exiting. He could still hear the devouring of Dr. Rothbard from inside. Trappe could barely breathe. He felt a pain in his chest and thought maybe a heart attack would spare him from a zombie death. He knew he couldn't stand there forever, so he looked around for anything he could use to barricade the zombies inside. Unfortunately, there was nothing but some leaves and a few twigs on the ground. Trappe thought back to the employee manual and the protocols, the rules that were put in place to prevent this sort of event from occurring, the rules he forgot to follow. As best he could remember, there was nothing in these documents about what to do if a zombie escaped. It's as if Hurstlander couldn't have even imagined it happening. The zombies began banging at the door behind him, moaning, growling, wanting to eat. Trappe was screwed. He was alone in the woods of Vermont, a place with no phone reception, and if he let go of this door, a gang of zombies would unleash themselves upon the world. Stay and die, or leave and let others die. Those were the options. The banging grew louder, the zombies pushed more forcefully. Trappe didn't think he could hold them for much longer. Get to town, get to the police, he said to himself. As Trappe was about to run to his truck, he realized the keys were inside the clinic. The only thing he had on him was his pack of Camels and a lighter. More banging from inside, stronger pushing, louder moaning. Trappe looked to Rothbard's Subaru. It was his only other option. He closed his eyes and said a silent prayer, asking God to please get him out of this mess. After an extra Hail Mary, Trappe sprinted to the Green Forester. The car was unlocked. He looked back and the clinic door flew open. 3 zombies stumbled outside. He got in the car, locked the doors, and looked down to see the keys dangling in the ignition. Jackpot! As he put the car in gear, he slammed his foot on the gas and sent a cloud of dirt towards the zombies. Lunenburg was the closest town to the clinic, about 25 miles away on a rutted dirt road. Trappe's ass felt like a piñata as the wheels of the Subaru bottomed out on pothole after pothole. He smashed the gas pedal to the floor mat, doing his best to reach the sheriff's station before the zombies could reach any houses. It wasn't the zombie babies and their crawling Trappe was worried about. He knew those wouldn't get far. Anything toddler and above was a different story, however. They could move fast. Dr. Rothbard told him once how they used to do zombie races for fun around the holidays. He said if they were well fed before the race, they could almost get to normal human running speed. Lunenburg wasn't just the closest town, but it was also the biggest of the county. About 1,000 people were split up among the villages of West Lunenburg, South Lunenburg, Mill Village, which was also called Northern Lunenburg, and Gilman. At most, Trappe figured the zombies could get to the edges of West Lunenburg, maybe attack some of the more rural households, but he doubted they would go beyond that, not unless they had more time. So West Lunenburg would be where he would tell the sheriff to start the zombie hunt. Dr. Trappe didn't know the Lunenburg sheriff that well. He only met him once at the clinic, when Sheriff Jeffrey Benson swung by for some autopsy results. As far as the sheriff knew, autopsies were pretty much the only thing the clinic did. He would probably never believe the zombie stuff, even if he saw it with his own eyes. It took 30 minutes of bat-out-of-hell driving to get to the parking lot of the sheriff's station. It was record time, and other than maybe needing some new shocks or struts, the Subaru held up just fine. Trappe couldn't say the same thing about his ass, however. He ran up the steps and burst into the sheriff's station like a gangster holding up a bank. Sheriff, we need guns, we need people! Sweat was pouring down Trepay's face. He was a lunatic in a bloody lab coat, barking across the reception's desk to the sheriff and his deputies in the back. There's been an accident at the clinic! We need help! We need everyone! We need every gun! Now! We need to go now! A startled Deputy Ray Mueller unholstered his gun and pointed it Trepay's direction. Sir, you need to calm down and show us your hands. This got the other deputies jumpy as well, and they unstrapped their guns. There's been an emergency, Trepay pleaded, ignoring the directive and the guns pointed at him. Every second here puts people's lives at stake. We need to hurry. This is serious. Hearing the commotion, Sheriff Benson came rushing from his office. He looked around and saw his deputies with their guns pointed and instinctively grabbed his. Then he looked and saw a frantic Dr. Trepay in a bloody lab coat pacing near the reception. Doctor, he shouted. You need to calm yourself down or you're liable to get shot. We do not want that. I suggest you do what these deputies say. Show us your hands, then compose yourself. Catch your breath, and then tell us in a calm voice why on God's green earth you've come in here ranting and raving. Trepay didn't think he had time to follow orders, but he now noticed the guns pointed at him and the scared way the deputies were looking at him, so he obliged. After showing his hands and catching his breath, he explained the situation as calmly as he could. He told the sheriff the whole unbelievable story from the beginning. He said the clinic secretly took in near-dead pregnant women who gave birth to the dead alive. Zombies. He said it's been going on since the 40s with no problem. But today they had a problem. The zombies escaped. They've had a half hour, maybe 40 minutes to roam the woods, Trepay told the sheriff. They smell flesh just like animals do, real good at it. I suspect they'll head to West Lunenburg first since that's the closest to the clinic. Please, we must hurry. By this point, the entire sheriff's department was huddled around, listening to Trepay's half-baked story. As he spoke, half the force was texting the news to neighbors and friends, warning them to either get the hell out of Dodge or grab their shotgun and bunker in the basement. When he was finished, the sheriff squinted his eyes and gave his bloody lab coat a once-over. He tapped his chin and let out a before he said in a slow and deliberate voice, I believe you're too scared to be lying to us with this tale, as unbelievable as it is. Which means, of course, we've got ourselves a grade A problem. It was perfect sheriff logic. There's no time to waste, Trepay said. They could have killed already. Let's hope not, Sheriff Benson said. Turning to the crowded deputies, he said, we need everyone in on this one. Chet, Dale, Mike, Greg. You guys head towards the clinic. 2 cars, 2 people each. 1 drives, 1 searches. Head on a swivel. You see one of these suckers, you shoot the hell out of it. Unload your damn clip. Understood? They all nodded in unison. Shoot the head, Trepay added. You must shoot the brains to kill them. Another nod. Understood. The rest of us, the sheriff added, will head back towards West Lunenburg and we'll work our way towards the clinic from there. Trepay, you're with me. Pray to God we get there in time. Okay? Now let's get at it. Guns at the ready, ears on at all time. You tag one, you report it. Understood? Sir, yes, sir, came the collective response. Part 3. Miss Radish's Baby. As Sheriff Benson pushed 100 on a 40-mile-per-hour road, his siren blaring and 3 other cop cars behind him, Trepay thought more about his life and taking the path of least resistance. Maybe sometimes that's what's best, he thought. It's what the zombies do, after all. They smell flesh, they go to flesh. He could have taken over the funeral parlor from his father and had a good life in Quebec, but instead he had to do his own thing, to try and make his own way and put his own stamp on life. And now, because of that, he wasn't sure he would get out alive from this mess, or even worse, whether he would cause a zombie apocalypse. No, Trepay thought, the world needed fewer people trying to change it and more people trying to help solve everyday issues. A squawk on Benson's radio broke up Trepay's daydreaming. Got one of the motherfuckers! It was Chet. His voice was amped with adrenaline, the kind that comes from a kill. They're fucking kids, Sheriff! They're kids! He didn't say we're shooting fucking kids! Sheriff Benson looked at Dr. Trepay, who gazed down at the floor in shame. 0 to 14 years old, Trepay mumbled. The sheriff got back on the horn. They're zombies, Chet, not kids, zombies. Remember that. As the sheriff's crew raced towards West Lunenburg, the village looked calm, not a zombie in sight. The police caravan slowed to a crawl. Heads turned left and right, scanning the open fields and trees, looking for any sign of something amiss. Sheriff Benson asked for a report from each car. Those in West Lunenburg saw nothing, but the 2 cars that went to the clinic said they tagged 6 zombies. 5 were eating Dr. Rothbard's remains in the clinic, and 1 was running along the road. "Good job," the sheriff radioed back. Turning to Trape, he asked, "How many of these zombies are we dealing with? You didn't say." "A dozen," Trape said. "We had a dozen." Sheriff Benson got back on the radio. "Halfway there, boys. Chet, Mike, you see anything else at the clinic?" "Negative," Chet responded. "We'll circle the perimeter one more time, but I don't think we'll find anything else. I think we got them all." The cop cars drove slowly up and down each road in West Lunenburg, crisscrossing 5 times in each direction. There were no signs of zombies anywhere in the village. Residents appeared safe. Nosy old lady McDougal came outside when she saw the parade of cars creeping by, but Sheriff Benson hollered at her something fierce, so she quickly ducked back inside her home. Dr. Trape picked up the radio microphone to talk to Chet and Mike. He wanted to gauge the age of the zombies they killed so he could figure out which ones they needed to be watching for and whether they would be fast or slow. Mike said it was hard to tell on account of the zombies' rotting skin, but as best they could figure, the ones they got were between the ages of 2 and 10. Not exactly helpful information, Trape thought. After exhausting every road in West Lunenburg, the sheriff thought they needed to search on foot. He said they'd head back to the houses off of Route 15, then go into the woods towards the clinic from there. They'd go shoulder to shoulder. If nothing else, he said, their presence would put the scent of meat in the air. "Maybe we'll get lucky and the zombies will come straight towards us," he said. Trape nodded. "Smart," he said. Sheriff Benson asked the doctor if he knew how to shoot a gun. After another nod, Benson handed him his police-issued Mossberg 590 tactical shotgun. "Don't miss," the sheriff said. "You got us into this mess, so your ass is on the firing line just like the rest of us." The group moved slowly through a field of grassland, over a nearly dried-up offshoot of Mink Brook, and into the woods towards the direction of Hearstlander Clinic. After walking a bit through the trees, Officer Shane Jaime heard some rustling and a growl on the other side of a bush, and pulled the trigger without hesitation. "Got one!" he yelled. Not too much later, Officer Helen Daniels did the same. "Yeehaw!" she yelled. "This is how you do it, boys!" Though she was the only woman on the force, Officer Daniels was still considered one of the guys. She never asked to be treated any different and didn't want any handouts on account of her gender. The officers gave her none. It went on like this for 3 hours, walking, shooting, hooting, and hollering. It almost seemed as if the deputies were having fun. Final shot came from Sheriff Benson himself as he put a slug into the brains of an infant zombie who was gnawing on a squirrel. The zombie's head was so small that the slug made it explode like Gallagher hitting a watermelon with a sledgehammer. After doing a quick mental body count, the sheriff called off the search. "We got 'em all," he said, "and we got lucky. This could have gone horribly wrong. Even if one person was bitten, from what Dr. Trape tells me, that would have been enough to trigger a massive calamity." Dr. Trape wanted to thank the sheriff and his deputies, but he knew better than to raise his voice. Given that he was the one who didn't lock the zombie cage in the first place, he thought it best to hide in the background and pretend he wasn't even there. On the drive back to town, a more relaxed Sheriff Benson told Trape that he had a lot of explaining to do. He said he didn't know whether he would write up what happened because the boys over in Montpelier would think he was back on the drink. So right now, he said, he was thinking of letting the whole thing slide. No one got harmed, except Dr. Rothbard, Trape pointed out. No one from town, the sheriff clarified, and that may be enough to keep it under wraps. He said no one knew or cared about the clinic other than for the occasional autopsy results, so there won't be any questions about that. But, all the same, the sheriff wanted Dr. Trape to give a formal statement just in case it was needed at some point. The sheriff allowed Trape to head back to the clinic to get his belongings and say a final word to his friend, Dr. Rothbard. Sheriff Benson told Trape to come back to the station when he was done, noting that if he didn't show, they'll put out a statewide alert. "Remember, we got a dead body at the clinic, and co-workers are usually the first suspect," Sheriff Benson said with a wink. On the way back to the clinic, Trape took it easy with Rothbard's Subaru. It wasn't that he cared about the car, Rothbard didn't need it anymore, but Trape didn't think his ass could take the potholes. When he pulled up to the parking lot, Trepay saw the 6 zombies the sheriff put down, brains oozing from the bullet holes in their heads. He smirked. The path of least resistance, he said to himself. Before he opened the clinic's doors, he paused and thought back to the zombies that were eating Rothbard and how feral they were. They were an abomination that should never have been allowed to live. He wished he never went to the Bahamas, never met Rothbard, and never found out about this mysterious place. He popped another Camel from his pack, lit it, and took a few deep drags as he steeled himself for the horror that awaited him on the other side of the door. As he walked in, Dr. Trepay saw Samantha Radish, her limbs hacked off on the mortuary table, her pregnant belly still bloated and distended. On the floor, Trepay saw Rothbard, or what was left of him anyways. Rothbard was disemboweled and his legs had chunks taken out of him. Trepay doubled over and fought back the urge to vomit. A low rumble made him freeze. It came from Rothbard. Trepay dropped to his knees and got a closer inspection of his friend. Rothbard was turning into the very thing he guarded and cared for throughout his career. Trepay thought the transformation was both fascinating and sickening. As Rothbard turned into the undead, he raised his head slightly and chomped at Trepay, almost getting close enough to nick his nose. Trepay yanked his head back to dodge the attempt. The zombie who yanked on his lab coat earlier in the day was as close of an encounter as Trepay ever wanted to have with the undead. Protocol, he thought. Not wanting to take any more chances, Dr. Trepay went to the counter and picked up the captive bolt pistol. "I'm sorry, my friend," Trepay said as he pulled the trigger. Seeing Rothbard's brains seep onto the floor brought the heaviness of the day crashing down on Trepay. He couldn't fight back the tears. Everything was his fault. He dropped the pistol and crumbled to his knees next to his dead friend. "I'm sorry," he said, covering his face in shame. "I'm so sorry. Please forgive me." As Trepay mourned, Samantha's belly began to rumble and move on the mortuary table. Trepay was too lost in his sorrow to hear. He didn't notice Miss Samantha Radish's baby boy emerge from her uterus for a second time. The sheriffs who entered the clinic never looked inside the dead pregnant woman on the table. She wasn't a zombie. The baby's sharp gums broke the skin on Trepay's neck with ease. One bite was all it took. As his life faded, Trepay thought back to the baby's birth and what Rothbard said. "A baker's dozen," Trepay said as blackness encroached upon him. "A baker's dozen."